Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on Speed Up Your Applications with Azure Cache. My name is Roman Shire. I work for Microsoft. I am a part of team called as Fast Track, and today we are going to talk about Redis Cache. I have my colleague with me. His name is Satish Kumar.
Thank you, Roman. Hello, everyone. I'm Satish, Senior Customer Engineer as part of Fast Track for Azure from Microsoft.
So Satish will join us in the second half of the session. Let's first talk about our agenda. What are we going to cover in this particular session? Let's begin with the slides. So let's go to the introduction, and the agenda we have for this is, so we'll talk from why do we need a cache, right? So what is the use of a cache in our applications? Then we'll specifically talk about what is Redis, right? What does Redis help us with? We'll talk about what are our different offerings available on Azure Cloud for Redis, and what are its different use cases, patterns, how we can use them. We'll also talk about an application pattern, and we'll show it with an example as to how do we use Redis. And we'll close out talking about how enterprises can leverage this offering from Microsoft about Azure Cache for Redis. What are all the enterprise features? What are the enterprise level things that Microsoft has bought it up for you, right? So let's move to the next slide. So let's talk about why cache, right? The first thing that we use cache for is to speed up our data access. Now, when I say speed up data access, assume we have an application where we have an application that is simply pulling some form data from its database. Now, a lot many users might be on the application and pulling data from the database. And since it is a form data, right, for a particular user, it is the same set of data being retrieved again and again and again. So we want to reduce our network calls. We also want to reduce the time in which our application sends a request to the database processes it, and then gives it back to the application. What we simply do is we introduce a cache as a memory in the middle, right, between your application and database, and that cache speeds up our data request, right, serving up our data. How it does that? It stores a copy of data in its memory, and then the memory is fast as compared to a database. It just gives that data to the application, right? So what it also does is, since now certain amount of requests are being served by the cache memory, it decreases the load on database. Since the data is closer to the application, the time to serve that data is reduced, and our availability also increases. So these are the basic reasons why in the first place we use a cache. And now let's talk about what is Redis. So let's move on to the next slide. Now, so what is Redis? We talked about what a cache is, but what is Redis? Redis is an open source in memory key value data store. Now, what that means is it is a memory that stores a key and a value, right? So it is a key and a value store where you store a lot of these key and value pairs as a memory, and uh, when you query that particular memory, that is the Redis, it serves you as a key and a value pair. So it is often referred to as a data structure since there are keys and values, and the values can be strings, lists, sets, bitmaps, etc. Right? Now, Redis is open source and it delivers sub-millisecond response times. So it is very, very fast, right? It has been proven at scale, and a lot of applications or modern websites that you use today use Redis. Now, a few of the well-known things that you know that you use in your daily life, and they use Redis are Twitter, GitHub. Again, at such a huge scale, Redis is being used. Weibo, Pinterest, Snapchat, Stack Overflow, etc. Right? So it's a proven set, proven at scale, proven by organizations who are using this open source technology called Redis. And what it is a key value store which helps you reduce the application response time, and so on and so forth, right? And since it is open source and it is also used such heavily in the developer community, uh, we have a very knowledgeable community built around Redis. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about what on Azure we have an add-on to the open source Redis, right? Now, what we have done is we have taken this open source Redis that is so famous across the developer community, and we have hosted it on Azure. Now, what that gives us is the extreme performance of Redis, then the SLAs of Azure, right? The dedication or hosted, how hosted Redis provides you with features, you get that with scale and security of Azure. Now, Redis, again, simple to migrate to Redis, and it is as simple as easy to migrate to Azure Cache for Redis as well. So it's very simple and quick to onboard. We take the native flavor of Redis, the native open source flavor of Redis, and host it on Azure for you so that your time to manage, your responsibility to manage, and the effort that goes into manage and keeping an uptime onto Redis is reduced for you, and you can focus on leveraging those particular features and simply use it for your team and reduce the response time for your end customers. So let's talk about the offerings we have on Azure. We'll go to the next slide. And these are the different SKUs available on Azure. Now, when I say SKUs, these are the different audiences that these have been targeted to. You might be a developer and want to test it out. Then in that case, you might use the basic SKU. So it's a single node virtual machine in the backend that is hosting your Redis cache, right? It is only for testing purpose. So the cache memory you get ranges from 250 MB to all the way to 53 GB, right? You can serve up to zero point 0.6 to 150K requests per second. Since it is for testing and it is a basic flavor of the service, there is no SLA guaranteed with this particular SKU. It supports communication through private link. That is, your communication can go through a private Microsoft hosted backbone, and it supports scaling as well, right? Now, you might also be a team that does want a certain amount of availability, but you might be a small team hosting it for your small application, not a very critical application, but small time applications as well. In that case, you can leverage the standard tier or the standard SKU. Again, the memory range is same, 250 MB to 53 GB. The request per seconds remain the same. However, now the standard tier comes with a 99.9% availability. So you have three nines of availability guaranteed from Microsoft, right? And again, you can communicate from private link and can scale it as well. Now, these are for individual developers, small teams. However, you may want to go a little bit higher in terms of your application requirements, in terms of your availability, and in terms of your features that you demand from this particular service. So in that case, we have the premium tier. Now in the premium tier, we have multi-node or multiple shard shared cache. What that means is you have more than one virtual machines separated out in different availability regions, and then they provide you a higher availability of the service. You have an increased memory for the cache that ranges from 6 gigabytes to 1.2 terabytes. You have an increased request per seconds, that is 140 to 250K requests per seconds. Again, the availability increases from 99.9, that is three nines, to 99.95%. You can connect to it using a private link service or a VNet as well. It supports horizontal and vertical scaling, so you can scale out the number of virtual machines that are hosting your service, and you can vertically scale as well, meaning you can change the size of virtual machines hosting your service, and it supports zone and geographic redundancy as well. Right? Now, last is the enterprise service. Now, this particular service, enterprise service, hosts a flavor of Redis that has been developed by Redis and Corporation or Redis Labs as well, right? And it has certain flavors which Redis Labs has catered for its enterprise users. So it is not the open source Redis that is hosted in the enterprise service. It is an enterprise version of Redis, uh, specifically targeted towards the enterprise customers, and it has a feature called as Redis modules, right? So Redis modules are modules specifically developed by Redis Labs, which help you attain additional functionality which is not available in the basic, standard, and premium SKU, which hosts open source Redis. And the example of such features are Redis search and Redis tables and so on and so forth, right? Again, in terms of your memory, ranges from 16 gigabytes to 13 terabytes, and your availability goes all the way up to 5 nines for this particular service. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Okay. So at this point, let's jump over to Azure portal and let's see how to spin up this service called as Azure Cache for Redis. So in my recent Azure services, you will see Azure Cache for Redis, right? But if you do not see it in your recent services because you might not have used it, you can search at the top in the Azure bar and search for Azure Cache, right? And in the services, you will see for Azure Cache for Redis. So I'll click on this particular feature here and I'll click on create. For me, I already have a couple of one running, and for this demo, let's go ahead and create a new one. And we'll see all the options that we'll have to go through to spin up this Azure Cache for Redis. Now, the form is very similar to that you'll see of spinning any Azure service. So we'll start with a subscription and a resource group. I'll select a resource group called as speed up that I have used for this particular demo, right? Then I want to give it a name. The DNS name is unique across the internet. So we'll name it as, let's say, speed up demo 3, and a location can be data center close to me. Central India is fine for me. And then the cache type, right? So we have all the different types, enterprise, basic, standard, premium, right? uh, all of these are available for us, a huge list. And you will see on the right hand side with, let's say, the different capacity of these particular uh, types that you have. So you might have a standard of 1 GB cache, and then you can also have a premium with 6 GB cache. You might have an enterprise with 12 GB cache, and then you might have an enterprise flash. Now, enterprise flash is an add-on version that lets you have your disk memory as an add-on to the cache as well. So at a lower cost, you are able to have a you know bigger cache memory there as well. So that is one additional feature that Azure Cache for Redis provides you. For this demo, let's select a premium P1, right? And then let's click on networking. In the networking, you can select a public endpoint, that is the traffic goes through internet. However, it is still secured by TLS, but the traffic is routed over internet. You can connect it using a private endpoint. In that case, you will have to use a private like service, right? And then the data transfers over Microsoft Backbone and it never goes over to the internet. Or you can also connect it to a virtual network of your choice. For this demo, let's select public endpoint and click on next. So you can enable non-TLS ports as well to communicate quickly for your development purposes. You can select the version of Redis that is hosted. Let's select 6. You can select availability zones, as to how many availability zones your cache can be hosted. It also increases the availability. You can also select the number of replicas that you are spinning up for your demo. So you can spin up a number of a certain set of replicas for your demo as well. So for this particular demo, and to spin it up quickly, I will just select one availability zone and one replica count. Then you can also see, how much, that is the number of machines you have to provision, so that you get better performance in that particular case, and you see your cost at the available, for the particular month as that. So I'll click on next. I will leave out the tags. I'll click on review and create. So I'm running my final validations. My validations are running, right? And I will go ahead and click on create. So my deployment has been submitted, and it does take a while to spin up the Redis cache for Azure. So on an average, it takes around 5 to 10 minutes, right? So I still have a couple of services that I have spinned up already. Let's just see uh, them through the Azure portal and see what we get through. So I'll go to my resource group speed up. Here I already have my Azure cache for Redis spinned up. Let's go to the speed up demo 2, and let's see what is all the information we get, right? So we see it is running a premium 6 gigabytes cache service. We see our host name, our ports, non-SSL ports have been disabled. We also have a best practices and new features on the right hand side as well. So if you go through the service, check out the best practices, check out the new features on a regular basis to see what all is being uploaded. You can interact with the service at the console at the top. On the left, we can go to settings. We can scale out or scale up our cache depending upon, let's say, our requirement has changed. Now we want to increase or decrease the size. We want to increase our cluster size. At that, we might want to increase our shards. We might want to persist some data in our particular Redis cache. We might want to increase our geo replication if at a later point of time after spinning up, we understand some of the users are in a different part of globe, and we want to spin up services closer to them so that the response time decreases for those particular users. So we can do geo replication. We can configure private endpoint or virtual networks. We can also use firewall, so on and so forth. So this is Azure Cache at a very high level, right? This is Azure Cache, spinning up Azure Cache and the services at a very high level. Let's talk more about Azure Cache, and this time we'll invite Satish to talk more about Azure Cache.
Thank you, Roman, for going through what Azure Cache for Redis is and how to create in Azure portal. Let's dive into some of the use cases here. So there are multiple use cases for Azure Cache for Redis, right? While we cover just only few, there are some common use cases like caching, which Redis is one of the ideal scenario, right? So mostly in applications where there will be a backend database, right? Either it can be a relational database or a NoSQL database, right? Uh, there might be a lot of queries to the backend, which slows down the application. And Redis is usually one of the solutions to speed up the application in this case. The reason being that it handles millions of requests per second, and obviously Redis is highly available and performant, right? And in this case, there will be an intermediate layer because Redis is in memory. So the request will usually go to Redis, and then if the data is not available in Redis, and that's when the database is queried, right? So this is one of the common use cases which you can find in every scenario. And second thing is mainly around using Redis for session storage, right? So in case of multi-tenant application or a distributed application where you run multiple instances, usually we will end up having something called sticky session where users from a single session will always go to the same backend. That's the traditional approach, but there are certain scaling limitations in this approach. And that's why Redis is an ideal scenario to solve this problem. So in this case, we will use Redis to store the session information, and then we will use Redis to query all the session details uh, when a user actually logs into any of the instances in the backend, right? So the reason why Redis is ideal scenario here is that it serves request in sub millisecond latency, and it stores a lot of information like user profile details. There might be session token, credentials, or even user data as well, right? So we can store everything in Redis, and as and when needed, we can just have a quick lookup and populate the data. So that's the second use case. And the third one is around fraud detection. Redis usually have lot of AI and ML capabilities as well, and it runs ML models along with the data. So in case where there are scenarios like we need to analyze huge amount of data and run ML models, right? So Redis ideally support that as well. And there are certain Redis modules which help achieving these capabilities as well. So, and fourth use case is something around managing real-time inventory. This is primarily applicable for scenarios like e-commerce and shopping carts, where we want to maintain inventory details across multiple distributed applications. And there are certain capabilities like clustering and sharding, right, which spread data across multiple places, right? So that helps in managing the inventory data up to date in, across the cluster. Right? So final use case which I'm going to touch is primarily around the gaming leaderboards. So in case of multiplayer games, there are scenarios where we need to show the player leaderboards like rankings. And this involves a lot of computations, particularly across millions of users if this um, uh, uh, just a crazy, I mean, leading game in the market, right? So in this case, right, so there needs to be computations which we need to do across multiple factors, and there may be complex mathematical process which we need to run. And that's where there are certain data sets like sorted sets in Redis which help run these complex use cases as well. And again, so these are just some of the simple use cases, not the complete list, but we just want to give you an idea of what you can achieve with Redis, right? Then moving on, while you are designing scenarios with Redis, there are some patterns or use cases which you need to keep in mind so that you can design it right, right? So first thing I like to talk is something called data cache. So this is ideal for scenarios, as I mentioned earlier, right, where you can have a Redis mainly for caching. And in this particular pattern, right, usually we will not load every data directly in Redis at once. We usually follow something called cache aside pattern, where whenever there is a need for a particular data, that's when we have a lookup and then we will store the data in the cache, right? So by doing that, right, we avoid unnecessarily load on Redis as well, but we will speed up the application overall so that the subsequent request will directly look up cache and we'll get the right information directly, right? So this is one of the common pattern which is used. And second thing is what we call content cache. This is ideally applicable for scenarios where we are running some static websites which have a lot of static content, say for example banner page, header, footer, etc., right? So in this case, instead of looking all the details to the backend, right, we can have some of this static content cached in Redis, and it will be quite faster compared to look out all the static information somewhere else. Uh, there are scenarios where we can use this pattern along with something called content distribution network or CDN. But indeed, even without CDN, Azure serves that purpose as well. And third pattern we usually call is what we call session store pattern. So in this Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is ideal for scenarios like shopping cart, where user needs to maintain his session information or whatever the items added in the shopping cart, which needs to be accessed when user logs in again. Say, for example, now I'm in a web browser accessing a shopping page, and I have added few of the items there. Right. Next, after a while, a day or later, I log into my mobile app, and I expect that whatever my items added as part of the shopping cart should be available across the devices as well, right? So in this case, right, ideally we use something called cookies, and cookies is mainly client based and it will not persist across. But there are good reasons to use Redis for these scenarios as well. And the drawback with cookies is that, right, if we want to add lot of user or session information, right, the cookie size gets bigger and bigger, and this will have a direct performance impact on the overall application performance. The reason being that we have to get some details from cookie, and then we have to query the backend database every time. That's when Redis comes in handy, where we will have just simple information in cookies, whereas if we have complex user details, right, we can have a lookup directly in the Redis based on the cookie values as well, right? So, and other pattern is something called job and message queuing, where there might be scenarios where we need to run asynchronous application, and using something like queue might be a desirable thing, just to decouple different part of the application. And in this case, Redis supports something called queue, and there are additional features like publish and subscribe, which in case if there is a single process running to process all the information, right? So queue might not be the ideal use cases as well. So that's why we have, in addition to queue, there are publish subscribe options, and yeah, we can use uh, complex, I mean, Redis for complex application as well. And final pattern is around distributed transaction. In this case, ideally, right, some of the uh, uh, transaction needs to be executed at once. For example, in case of banking scenarios, right? If there is a money transfer involved from one account to another, there might be two or three transactions combined. So one is that again, the source account needs to be debited, and the target accounts needs to be credited, and there might be a transaction log added at the both accounts, and then everything needs to be either executed at once or roll back at once as well. So in these cases, right, Redis supports something called batch transactions, where we can ideally uh, use this for transaction-based scenario as well. So let me talk about a simple pattern or an example, right? In case of this architecture, uh, uh, you as a user, right, might be using using either a web browser or your mobile device. Exactly in case of a shopping cart, where you might be connecting to either app service or a mobile app endpoint, and whenever you want to have a lookup, right, you usually connect to a backend database. Either it can be a NoSQL database like Cosmos DB, or it can be a SQL based scenario, either MySQL or regular SQL database, right? So first thing you usually do is that query the database, get that information, and show it back to the user, right? So in this case, it's highly inefficient. The reason being that uh, you might be running a lot of queries, and there might be latency involved in the database, and that's why you have something called Redis cache in between, and the flow now is a bit altered, right? So whenever there is a new request coming in, the request is usually looked up into something called Redis. And if it is already there, it will be immediately written. But in first transaction, right, Redis will be empty, and that's why you will query the database in the backend, and then you will store a copy of the data in the Redis, and then you will send the data back to the browser. right? So next time when another user is looking for the same data, maybe as a part of mobile app, the first lookup usually is Redis, right? So in this case, the data is available readily in Redis, and then we usually uh, get the response immediately, right? So that's a common pattern we follow. Let's jump into a demo, ideally two demos, to showcase what exactly you can achieve uh, with leveraging Redis, right? The first demo which I talk about is how to use Redis as a session store. Okay, let's jump into a demo and we will see how you can leverage Redis for storing it as a session cache. Let me share my screen. Here you are seeing my Azure portal where I have pre-created two Redis instances. So one, I can use it to showcase how we use Redis as a session store, and one as how you can use it for content cache, right? So first thing we need to look at is grab the Redis connection information here under access keys. And let's switch back to Visual Studio. So this is a sample web API application based on .NET, uh, .NET 6 framework. So here, if you look at, right, so first thing we need to do is add the necessary dependencies. So here in case of .NET, right, let's go to NuGet package, and we will see there is something called stack exchange.redis, right? So that's the NuGet package which we need to have. And once we added those packages, right, so there are certain configurations we can do. So first thing is we can add um, yeah, so we can get the connection string here. We are getting from the configuration. And once we got the connection string, we add services dot add stack exchange Redis cache. So that's the method which is provided by the NuGet package, and we pass the options, either the connection string, and if we want to rename the database uh, uh, for Redis, right? So we can pass all those information, right? So and once we did this configuration, right? So let's go to our sample controller. So this application, again, I'm marking a backend DB. So in this fake database, right, I'm just defining a couple of car models, right? Honda Civic and Kia Seltos, and I'm trying to get it from the fake database, right? But the actual flow I have defined is that, right? So we have two methods defined. One, um, uh, first thing, right? We will try to load data from the cache. So here uh, I'm trying to get the information from cache, and if it is already there, then I'll return the response with a field called load from Redis is true, and I'll pass on the data. Whereas, say for example, if the cache is empty, then what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the information from the backend database. Either it can be yeah, Cosmos DB or MySQL, etc. Right? So it's up to you to define the backend, but the logic here is that we will pull the data from this database, and then we will store the information in the cache, and then we will return the data with a flag called load from Redis is false. So from next time, once it's stored here, if we have a subsequent query, the data will be already in cache, and then we will be able to get the data directly from Redis. Let's run it. Okay, so we have the web browser launched, which shows the API definitions. So we have the core API here, and this is the HTTP GET as I shown the code. Let's try it out. So here, currently we don't have any parameters required. Let's execute. It will try to get the data from the backend API, and we are able to see uh, two of the car models which is available in the backend database, right? So here the data is already available in Redis, so that's why you see load from Redis is true. But if you are executing it for the first time, you might see it as false, and for the subsequent request, we will see this information as true, right? So that's the first demo. And next thing I'd like to show is how to use Redis as a session store. So here we are using Visual Studio Code. It's also again a simple web API. Only difference here is that, right? Um, Again, you might be using the same Stack Exchange package, NuGet package. You can install it from the NuGet package manager. And once you configure this, we need to um, define our startup. So that's in program.cs. We will see again similar information. One thing you need to specifically add is sessions. So services.add session. Here we can configure what's the name of the session, cookie configuration, whether we need to set up HTTP only flag, all those customizations can be done, right? So this is the additional thing which you need to do in case if you are using this as a session. So next thing we are getting uh, uh, connection information for Redis, and then we are leveraging Stack Exchange package. And once it's done, we need to use app.use sessions that will enable Redis as a session store. So similarly, coming back to our controller, so here we'll have two different APIs exposed, right? So one is read from the session, and second is write to session, right? So first time when we try to read something, we won't have any information. Whereas if we write it and then we'll read, we will be able to retrieve it there, right? Only difference here is that we are just not writing it in session, but we are actually writing it into a Redis, and Redis is actually reading here, right? So let's run it. It's called .NET Run, which builds this application. Yeah, and so we have this Swagger API exposed. We'll see there are like a read from session and write to session. Let's try it out. And if we try to execute initially, right? Uh, yeah, so we don't have any information. Body is empty. But yeah, so now let's try to write it in Redis. Let's try it out. Execute. So we just wrote a simple message, session written at the current time. That's it, right? So it's already written. Next time when we try to read this, right, we will see the same information here. So here we will see the same information with the same timestamp, 6/9/29 a.m. So yeah, so we can see this is how we can use Redis. Just to confirm, right, we are using the Redis backend. Let's go to VS Code. Um, there is an add-on for Azure Cache for Redis which I installed, and if I uh, go to that particular Redis instance, we will be able to see that information. So if I click on data, so there is a written data in the Redis session as well. Yeah, so this is how you can use Redis to integrate with your code. Okay, so that's all I had as part of the demo. Let's hand it over to Roman so that he can talk about some of the enterprise features which is available on Azure. Over to you, Roman.
Thank you, Satish. Thank you for your insightful session into Redis and also showing us different use cases in action. Right. So now that we have seen different use cases in action, let's talk about what are the enterprise features available in Azure Cache for Redis. So, as an enterprise, I look for availability, scalability, and security. During the course of this session, we have seen how we have different availability SKUs available. We range from 3 nines to 5 nines. In terms of scalability, we have different size of machines. We can run different number of machines to host our cache. And in terms of security, we can talk about how we route our traffic. Is it on the internet? Is it on the private backbone? Is it over a VPN? Right? And also, we are regularly patched and upgraded in the backend by Microsoft. Apart from that, our Azure Cache for Redis is compatible with any and many of the client APIs. So you can use your framework of choice, you can use your languages of choice to develop your application, and they'll still be compatible and will be able to leverage Azure Cache for Redis. Right. So we have different service level agreements based on your needs. So whether you need gigabit of memory or terabytes of memory, whether you need a high level scalability, you need high level availability, you need different persistent data storage, you need any of those needs, we have them available at different service levels, right? So with Azure Active Directory authentication and authorization inbuilt, you can integrate Azure Cache for Redis with it, and you have different role based access control based on owner, contributor, and reader, so that you can give appropriate privileges to your team members, and no one in your team has more privileges than required, right? So you have cache monitoring. You see your number of connections, number of requests, read and write directly on your dashboard. And for in-depth monitoring as well, it integrates more deeply with Azure monitoring, right? So based on your metrics, if something goes haywire, you might have alerts configured, and then you get alerts at that particular moment. Let's say your connections go beyond a particular threshold that you have set, you'll get alert that this particular connections or the connections are exceeding a particular number of threshold that you might have set. Your requests are exceeding a particular threshold that you might have set. So you get notified and you take remediative actions at ease. Right. You also have data partition and scaling available through sharding, and during transition, you have your data encrypted with TLS. Now, that was all from my side. I hope you enjoyed the session and you had some value delivered from me and from Satish. So, thank you, everyone. I hope you had a good time and we were able to provide some valuable information. Till then, have a good time and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you all. Again, we are excited to see a lot of your use cases around Azure Cache for Redis. We hope you have a wonderful future ready session. Thank you.